This series of talks, An American Spirituality for the 80s, was recorded live by St. Anthony Messenger Press. The speaker, Father James J. Basic, holds advanced degrees from Fordham and the Athenaeum of Ohio, and received his Ph.D. from the University of Oxford, England. A member of the Catholic Theological Society of America, he is presently Associate Pastor of St. Thomas More University Parish in Bowling Green, Ohio. He is also a part-time lecturer at Bowling Green State University and visiting assistant professor in the Graduate Theology program at the University of Dayton. Now, Father Basic.
Now, in this series of talks, I want to reflect on the topic of spirituality. I'm interested in trying to work out a contemporary spirituality, one that fits the 80s and the 90s, the period of time that lies ahead of us. And I'm interested in working out a homegrown spirituality, an indigenous spirituality, one that fits us in the United States. Now, when I start to use that word spirituality, I think it's important to begin with to get a feel for what I mean by that word. And when I'm talking about spirituality, what really comes to me are a lot of examples of people that I've talked to, people that I've counseled or dealt with, or people who come to me for spiritual advice. I think overall I end up learning more about spirituality from the people that I deal with than in any other way. I think, first of all, of the woman who comes to me. She happens to be married to an atheist, and she's not a Catholic, but she comes and says, "Father, what I'm trying to work on is to convince my husband of the importance of attending church services, of coming to Mass at your place." She says, "Well, it really means so much to me. I have this tremendous thirst for something, and I come there to church, and I feel as though I drink something in from the Scriptures and from the Eucharist, and that I go back home a better woman, a better wife, better mother, better able to deal with my family." And I was just hoping that I find a way to make that clear to my husband. So she speaks to me about this thirst for something in her life. She says that when she doesn't end up getting to church, that she feels very badly about it. In one way or another, she feels empty. Then I think of the social scientist at the university who calls me up and says, "Jim, I want to go out to lunch. Let's meet." And we get there, and he says, "You know, I have so many activities in my life. I have so many things going on with me. I'm involved in this and that. And what I really need is something that unifies all of those activities. I need something that pulls it together for me in my life, something that gives a focus to all of the various activities that I'm involved in." Again, I see that as part of this man's search for a spirituality. I think of the grad student in philosophy who comes to me and says, "Father, what I really need is a model in my life. You know, I need a model for understanding all the various experiences I have. I study various philosophies and so on, but I need a model within which to place all of those things. I need to find a way of interpreting my experience in a deeper way." I think of the young lady who comes to me and says that she's having all kind of trouble with her sexual life. She's having trouble dealing with her boyfriend. She describes to me that her training in a Catholic school. She says that the sisters put sort of strange notions of sex in her mind, that she came to think of it as something dirty and so on, and that she really feels if she's going to relate to this young man in any constructive way, that she has to find a healthier notion of sexuality and to be able to integrate that more clearly into her own life. I think of the man who comes to me and says that he's been going to a shrink now for 20 years. He grew up as a Catholic, and somewhere along the way in his early 20s, he decided that that wasn't a very adult thing to be a Catholic, and that that was rather childish, and what he really needed to do was to get that out of himself, to get rid of that Catholicism, to put it behind him. And so he said he began that systematic process, and has been going on with that for years now, and going to the psychiatrist psychiatrist and paying him a lot of money, and he tells me, I can't really get it out of my system at all. That Catholicism from my youth is in my bones, it's in my blood, it's part of me, and I can't, despite all of my efforts, get it out of my system. And he says, what I think that I've got to do now is to get back to those roots. I have to reappropriate, I have to make them my own in a way. I don't need a shrink anymore, he says. I need you. I need a spiritual guide. I need a director for my spiritual life. I want you, Father, to help me to find God again and to make my religion real to me again. So these are some examples of what I get from people about this search for a spirituality. It makes it all very concrete for me. It reminds me of my own search. When I think about what's going on in my own life, I come up with a line or an image from the poet Yeats that says, I'm searching for a center that holds. That image of a center that holds seems very important to me. It captures a lot of my own experience. What it suggests is that I am in search of a powerful point from within myself from which I can reach out to the world. What I need is a sense of confidence inside of myself so that I can take on all of the various tasks and responsibilities that I have. This center point needs to be a source of energy in my life, so when I have the blahs and when my spirit begins to flag, that I can call on it. That center is something you fall back on when things are tough, when difficult times are upon one. So that a center, somehow, it speaks of integration, of gathering one's forces, of a point inside of oneself where one is in touch with God, where the Spirit resides, and which serves as a constant source of inspiration and insight and energy for living life fully. The part of the notion that speaks about holding, a center that holds, indicates to me that any kind of a spirituality today is going to be under attack. That there are the icy winds that blow, that there are other people who don't share our particular value system, who end up even in subtle ways attacking what I hold as a Christian. There are doubts that can assail us. The culture calls into question so much of what we hold. The deep values that are inside of us are constantly under attack, and often in subtle ways so we can hardly even notice it. Culture has a different set of values, a different outlook than we hold as Christians very often. And so this center, therefore, is under attack from many sides. And the feeling one has is that one can easily be isolated and that one needs a certain strength in order to defend oneself against these attacks. One needs a self-confidence so that we don't get blown away by these icy blasts, but so that we can maintain our ground, so that we feel rooted someplace and we can deal with life as we find it. And so, in all these ways, this image for me of a center that holds captures much of what I'm talking about as the spiritual search. Now, let's try to generalize from some of those experiences, both of those whom I have counseled and from my own experience. What we notice, first of all, is that this spirituality that I'm talking about is not confined to the inner life or just a matter of prayer. Spirituality in this view is not just a matter of reading the Scriptures and going to church. It has to do really with the whole range of human activities. Now, it is probably good at the beginning to distinguish different usages of this word spirit. You can find this done in a lot of popular authors. Now, a good example would be Matthew Fox's book on becoming a musical mystical bear, where you see two different spiritualities distinguished according to the meaning of the word spirit. There's one kind of meaning of spirit that we get from the philosopher Plato. For Plato, the spirit or the soul was imprisoned in the body. and that the real salvation of man would come when that spirit would get out of the body, would be released from that prison, and would go back to the world of universal forms where it previously had existed. So that what we get here is a very poor notion of the human body as mostly as a prison, and a very poor outlook on the material world as mostly illusory or not important or functioning negatively. And that the real important thing in life is to escape from this world and to get up to that other pure world, an angelic world, a world of pure forms. Now, it so happens that Plato has ended up really influencing a lot of our thought about spirituality. It comes to us in the Christian tradition in some ways through St. Augustine, who was influenced by the Neoplatonists. And we probably get that most clearly in Augustine's notion of sexuality. Most people know a little bit about Augustine's background, that he did have a mistress and an illegitimate child and did a lot of wrestling with his own sexuality in his life. And it seemed as though that sort of left its mark on his own outlooks. But for him, sexuality was mostly a problem. There's that famous notion of his that even married people who would be involved in venial sin and having intercourse unless they were especially or explicitly intending to have children, which seems a very strange notion to many people, but indicates something of Augustine's attitude towards sexuality. Now, it's always difficult talking about Augustine because he's such a complex figure, and very often there are counterpoints to his thinking, but certainly what has happened as a result of St. Augustine's thought is that much of our Christian spirituality has been anti-sexual or had a diminished or poor outlook on human sexuality. Someone has once said that just as all of philosophy is a footnote to Plato, that all of theology is a footnote to Augustine, which helps us to appreciate perhaps the great influence he has had on Christians ever since his own time. He died back in 430. So it's another example here of the use of the word spirit, which ends up giving us a sort of poor notion of an integrated spirituality, poor notion of body, of physical world. There is the notion of Thomas à Kempis that we find in his famous Imitation of Christ. He once said, "The more violence you do to yourself, the greater will be your growth in grace." Violence to yourself. He's also the one who had the notion that every time you venture out into the world, that you're going to come back somehow tainted or less a man. Again, an anti-worldly sort of spirituality. In our own country, we have a strong feeling of this whole business from our Calvinistic roots. As we know that Calvinism had the notion of the essential depravity of human nature. That was John Calvin's idea. Human nature is essentially depraved, and therefore it is in constant danger of getting out of control. What we need is a lot of rules and laws to keep it in bounds. Again, this leads to very poor notions of our bodily life, our physical life, and very often our involvement in the pleasures, especially, of this world. So in all of these ways, we in the United States end up as Catholics and as citizens of the United States being influenced by an anti-world, anti-body sort of spirituality. It goes back to that root right in Plato that spirit is divorced from matter, that the soul is nothing more than imprisoned somehow in the body, that the body and the soul are separate entities. Now, there is, in the history of spirituality as well, another notion of spirit, which takes us back to the Hebrew Scriptures. In the Hebrew notion, spirit means breath and life. Spirit really is the wind. It is what is inside of a person that enlivens us. In the Hebrew notion, we are total beings. We are integrated creatures. We are not just a composite of a body and soul, but we are embodied spirits. We are a totality, and the spirit is what is inside of us that gives us our energy and our drive. Now we see that kind of notion played out in the New Testament as well, which leads to much greater emphasis on this world and involvement in this world and seeing the goodness of it. We take the example of Jesus himself. Now, you could contrast him with John the Baptist, for example. John the Baptist was an ascetic. He was out there in the wilderness eating locusts and grasshoppers and wearing rough garments and so on. No one ever accused John the Baptist of being a glutton and a drunkard. But Jesus, they did. Jesus is pictured as being at the parties, at the wedding feast of Cana. Jesus is involved in the world. He's not like the Essenes, the people in Qumran who left the world and went and lived in a monastery. He was with the people. He preached to the people. He went to their homes. He seemed to enjoy life. He was involved in nature. He liked to talk about the birds of the air and the lilies of the field. He was taken with the goodness of this world and the potential for this world for revealing God to us. Now, when we go on through Christian history, we can see others who have had this more what we'll call creation-centered spirituality, one that's based on a healthier notion, I think, of what spirit really is. We could look at St. Francis of Assisi again, a very appealing figure these days, one who gave up so many material things and yet had this really healthy outlook on the world. He could see a God in all of the things of nature, the folk legends about his closeness to animals and his care for all of God's creatures. Even he came to have that positive outlook on death. He could eventually call death brother death, closeness to this very real part of his life. In the modern world, we've seen a revival of this sort of outlook in Teilhard de Chardin, the great Jesuit geologist, paleontologist, and religious visionary. Teilhard wants to tell us again about the goodness of the world and the importance of us being involved, and he has that beautiful notion of the Mass upon the world. Now, instead of the Mass said at the altar with bread and wine, that the Mass said upon the whole earth as the altar, in which we are offering up all of the material things. All of the material world really is the host, the consecrated bread that we offer up to God. Teilhard said that because we are Christians, we need to be more passionately involved in the world, that we have to be caring about what is going on and trying to create a more humane situation in our world. Teilhard said that if the kingdom is going to be built, then we have to cooperate with God in that. So in that way, again, we see a much more positive notion of this idea of spirituality and what the word spirit really means. That second meaning has philosophical roots too. It goes back to Aristotle, who had a very different notion from Plato, that man was a composite, that the soul really was a principle within man, part of man, and that we were going to make sense out of our world as we find it here. He was interested in dealing with real life as he found it. There's a famous portrait by painting by Raphael that has Plato and Aristotle, and Plato is standing there pointing up to the sky, the otherworldly side, the heavenly sort of outlook. And there's Aristotle next to him standing there with his book of ethics pointing down to the earth and indicating again his care for human conduct, for the material world, for involvement in this world. And his great disciple, Thomas Aquinas, really fits into that whole idea too. He had a very creation-centered spirituality. For him, God was present in all of creation. Man was a unity, and especially that pleasure was a good thing, in opposition to that Calvinistic notion that really Aquinas saw that pleasure was a part of God's gift to us. There was a virtue even of play, a healthy sort of outlook on play. And we could end up finding God not in escaping the world, but in mining the riches of the world that God has given us. So to try to put that into some focus and or recap that, there really are two different notions of spirit that we find throughout our history. One is as spirit as opposed to matter. Spirit is what is not physical. In fact, that's probably the common notion that most people have. If you ask them, well, what's the opposite of spirit? Most people are going to say matter or the physical. And that, as you can see, has led us to this spirituality, which at least in my mind seems rather limited, which ends up being anti-body, anti-sexual, anti-worldly. On the other hand, there is this notion of spirit as breath, as life, as the principle within us that energizes us, so that here we would think of a spirited person as one who's alive, who's with it, who's involved. You think of, we talk about a spirited horse, for example, and you get an image there of horse being really lively and with it and so on. Here, spirit is not so much opposed to matter as opposed to death, as being collapsed or paralyzed or despairing. And spirit has this positive idea of being very much alive. So, now that is important, therefore, to have this notion in mind of what spirit is all about, because what I want to do is to build this idea of a spirituality based on that more creation-centered notion of spirit, spirit as breath and life. Then, when we look back at those examples that I gave, we can see that those people really are involved in a spirituality. What they are attempting to do is to find some meaning for themselves in life. They're struggling with absurdity. They're struggling with the threats to their existence, and they are involved in a quest for meaning in their life. See, what they're trying to do is to deal with the superficial world. They're looking for a deeper experience in the midst of all the superficialities that plague them. They want to not just live on the surface and flit around and be curious about many things, but they are serious about life, and they are looking to deepen their experience. They are looking for what I would call an ultimate context for their lives. Some sort of overarching framework within which they can fit their various experiences. That's what the meaning, I think, of the young graduate student in philosophy when he kept telling me, Father, give me a model. I think that's part of what he meant. He needed an overall meaning to his life. He had to be able to tell himself, well, what's it all about? Why am I studying this philosophy? And what can I do constructive with it in my life? So he's looking for an ultimate context for his life. What some of these people were looking for is what I'd call an ultimate concern, something to grab them when life appears dull. And so many people today, I find, well, they have the blahs and nothing interests them, and they're sitting around watching television all the time or drinking too much, and they can't really get with anything or get excited about anything. The search for a spirituality today is a search really for a concern, a cause, something that would galvanize us into action, that would energize and say, hey, I'm willing to get involved in this. I think of Martin Luther King's famous phrase that unless there's something you're willing to die for, you're already dead. And I think many people are feeling that, already dead in a way. And so the spiritual search is for an ultimate concern. The spiritual search is for a unified experience, something which will synthesize the opposites that we find in our lives, overcome the splits. The girl who was asking me about getting her head together in the sexual area is involved in that. She's feeling very split about this. Her head and her heart are out of sync. Her physical desires are she doesn't know what to do with them. So she's involved in the search for a unified experience which can overcome some of the splits that she feels have been ingrained in her as a result of her training. It really is a search for a richer, fuller, more human life for ourselves and for others. That is what this spirituality, I think, is all about. Now, I think that there's people all over who are involved in this. Wherever I go, if I'm at a party someplace, people will come up and get me aside and invariably say, hey, Father, I want to talk to you. There's something important going on in my life, and I really need to talk to you about this. People will are hungering for other people who they can talk to on a deeper level. So often people come to me, married couples, and they say, geez, I want to talk, but really she won't listen to me, or he doesn't understand. I'm tired of this cocktail-type conversation all the time, which just flits around and is so superficial. And when we find people like this who really are interested, it's really a gold mine. It's a wonderful thing. It indicates to me the depth of the spiritual search that's going on today. We live in a culture that in so many ways rules that out, where the serious questions don't seem to be considered, where so many things can be trivialized. And it is no wonder to me that we have a religious rebirth these days. Many years ago people were talking about the death of God back in the 60s, and religion was all over and there would be no need for all of that, and Harvey Cox wrote a book about the secular city and so on. And really all of that has not proven to be true. What has happened is, as our world has become more secular, as religion has gotten pushed to the corners of life, the deep religious interest has come up to the surface again. My position is that all of us, are religious beings. There is a quest within the center of our very heart that will not give us rest. Augustine said it a long time ago, that God has made us for himself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in him. And so I think when it is good for us to be discussing these questions of spirituality now, and as we go on with the discussion, that I hope that everyone keeps in mind the fundamental meaning of this spirituality. It's not at all a matter of just confining ourselves to prayer, although that certainly is an important part of it. It's not just having our eyes on heaven and waiting to get there. No, it's not just centered on sin and damnation and giving things up and mortifying ourselves. It's not just concerned with how to control our various urges and so on. It really is a search for a deeper and for a richer life.
Father Basic, St. Paul goes to great lengths to describe the difference between the spirit and the flesh. How do you fit that in with what you're saying?
Well, Mark, you're right. He does speak about the flesh warring against the spirit, and many people seem to interpret that in a sexual way. For one example, where the flesh indicates the whole sexual drive, which is going against reason and so on. As a matter of fact, Paul, being a good Hebrew, fit into that whole Hebraic spirituality that I was trying to describe, where he did see human beings as integrated wholes. For him, we were complete persons and not really a soul stuck into a body, nor was his real meaning that it was a matter of our physical nature simply warring against the spirit. What Paul really meant by that was that there was in us a whole drive moving us away from God, and that whole complex of temptation, of drive, of movement away from God, of evil inclinations, he termed sarx in the Greek, meaning flesh. So it's the whole complex of things that would take us away from God. On the other hand, for him, spirit meant all of those things which put us in tune with God, which brought us closer to God. So that really Paul fits into the whole framework that I've been talking about. It is a Hebraic spirituality in which we are integrated creatures, in which it is possible for us to move towards God or away from God. So that it's not good for people to make use of that statement of Paul to move us towards that very destructive kind of spirituality that is so otherworldly and anti-body. As a matter of fact, Paul's spirituality would be an extremely positive one, where because we possess the Spirit, we're supposed to be involved in the world. There are the fruits of the Spirit. If we are really active and if we're really close to God and have the faith, it's going to show up in our lives, in our bodily and physical life, and our social involvement, and so on.
All rights to this talk are reserved by St. Anthony Messenger Press, 1615 Republic Street, Cincinnati, Ohio, 45210. This series of talks, An American Spirituality for the 80s, was recorded live by St. Anthony Messenger Press. The speaker is Father James J. Basic.
We need a spirituality that is rooted in our experience of living in the United States in the 1980s. We need a spirituality that takes seriously our own experience, in which we learn to trust our own experience. Unfortunately, in the past, this has often been de-emphasized or played down, much to our detriment, I think. I'm thinking about a lot of criticisms of sermons that I've heard, mine included. People often come up to me and say things like, boy, the priest seems so far out of it, or he's not speaking to me at all, or that man lives in another world, or well, the kind of stuff he's talking about doesn't apply to my life at all. One guy was telling me one time, he says, he should ought to come over to my house at dinner time and see if all that stuff he's talking about makes sense to him or not. I've heard people who have listened to funeral sermons and say to themselves afterwards, that man simply doesn't know. I suppose that's one of the harshest criticisms of the preachers in the United States, is when people walk out of the church and sort of say that, well, he doesn't know what it's really like. Now, that is part of this problem that I'm talking about, that really many people in the Christian community have been taught not to trust their own experience. They have been taught to rely on authority figures for interpreting what is going on in their own lives. It's a matter of borrowing a spirituality from others. Now, as a whole, in the United States, we have tended to borrow our spiritualities from Europe. The great theologians were there. Their writings eventually became popularized or brought down to the level of the average person, and very often that was a spirituality rooted in a distinctive experience in Europe that seemed to have very little to do really with what was going on in the United States. And very often people just sort of took it uncritically and tried in some vague way to live it out, often with disastrous kinds of results. The other kind of borrowing that has gone on is by the lay people from the priests. Again, the assumption was that somehow the priests were the experts on the spiritual life. They, of course, were living this celibate existence. They were not married, and they were passing on this outlook on the world and ways to relate to God and how to be a follower of Christ in a way that very often the lay people simply couldn't understand or didn't make sense to them. Very often that spirituality was even a sort of monastic in its approach. It envisioned people off by themselves or having large blocks of time to pray and so on, all of which was very unreal. But again, the dynamic that was going on was that people were taking it seriously, or there really was an attempt simply to borrow or to take uncritically what was being said by these authority figures, these priests who were giving out this particular spiritual advice. Very often this approach was seen by people as being out of touch. It didn't seem real to them. If there's anything we need in today's world, it's a spirituality that helps us to live our everyday existence. It helps us deal with our common problems, to make sense out of our daily experience. We need a spirituality that helps people to cope with their children, especially when their children disappoint them. People want to know how to handle their temper at work when their nerves are frayed. People want to know how to find a little bit of space in their lives so that they can feel a refreshment or a peace. People want to know how to integrate their sexuality, to come to terms with their sexual drives. Those are the kinds of questions that people have, and very often the answers that are being given from the celibate world or from the world of European theology don't ring very true to people or are not really helping. Now, as a response to this problem, I want to try to develop the whole thesis that an important part of growing in the spiritual life is learning to trust our own experience. Now, that thesis is based on the theological point that our experience of self is really our experience of God. That is, the only way that we can experience God in our lives is through our experience of ourselves. It is us, our involvement in things, our relationship with people, our reactions to nature and so on. All of that is the substance of our interaction with God. All of these things are the vehicles of God's grace to us. We find God in our experience. See, we believe in a God who reveals himself, who's manifested himself to us human beings. This means that we have to take our experience seriously, because that's precisely where we meet our God. We're not the kind of people who think that we have to jump off into some other world to find God. We're going to find him here in the ordinary, the everyday, and the now. Now this, concretely, it means that people are going to have to make decisions about their own spiritual life. They're not going to just be listening to other people as to how they're to go about it. It means finding our own frequency of going to confession, for example, instead of just saying, well, you're supposed to go once a month, or the kind of period that is given to us in the past by some spiritual director or advisor. We have to make those decisions ourselves. We have to find our own rhythm in going to confession. How often do we have to go in order to make our own life richer, to keep from going downhill on one hand, on the other hand to make sure that it doesn't just become routine or just going through the motions. We have to find our own time for prayer, the period during the day when we are best able to pray. We have to make experiments in that regard in order to determine which time of the day will work best for us. Nobody else can probably tell us that. People can make suggestions about it, but we got to figure that out for ourselves. It's part of this business of learning to trust our own experience. Now, I think that we ought to go about this more systematically, really, and I'd like to borrow here a framework from the theologian by the name of Bernard Lonergan, who's written a lot on method and theology, and Lonergan tells us that if we are to learn and grow as individuals, there's really 4 rules that we ought to follow. He tells us that we need to be attentive, that we need to act intelligently, that we need to be reasonable, and that we need to be responsible. Now, I want to use that framework in order to develop this notion of what it means to trust our experience. First of all, we need to be attentive to what is going on in our lives. We have to have our eyes open. We have to be ready to think that that is where we are going to meet our God. Part of this is seeing what we habitually block on. What part of our experiences don't we notice? For example, some people just go along and never notice nature, never notice the fact that God may be revealing himself through the beauty of the sunset or the gnarled tree that is by the side of the road. We have to, part of being in touch with our experience is to recognize and be willing to accept our negative emotions. So often our approach to those is just to turn our mind off, or I'm not going to look at those things. Anything negative in our life, so easy to say, well, I'm not one who gossips. Or I'm never late, I just happen to have got caught in traffic today. That's an example of a denial of something that's probably true about ourselves. Better off if the person is saying, yes, I'm a gossip, and yes, I'm habitually late. That would be accepting part of our negative experience. I think maybe very often this happens with the negative emotions that we don't like at all, like jealousy, for example. Anger. It's amazing in today's world how many people cannot look at anger. That seems to, I know young people who can talk very freely about sexual matters, but still have a lot of trouble admitting the fact that they might be angry at their parents, for example, or at their friends. So being attentive means that we are trying to be in touch with what is going on with us. Now, we never can do that entirely. Our experience is so dense, it's so fleeting, there's so much of it that we could never mine all of its riches. There's no way we can be really cognizant of everything that is going on. But maybe what we have to do is to try to see what things we habitually block out. What things do we usually miss in our lives? We can probably only find that out by being quiet at times and stopping to reflect on it, or learning from the criticism of other people, for example, who tell us, boy, you really don't pay any attention to that, or you never notice this, or every time I give you this criticism, you just seem to turn off automatically. So to be attentive. Part of this attention, I think, is attention to our distinctive experience here in the United States. In other words, we have to be ready to see how our Christian faith relates to the real problems of the 1980s for us now. What does it mean to be a Christian in a world that is undergoing an energy crisis? What distinctive things do we have to contribute to that? Look at the breakup of family life and all of the problems around us of people who are suffering from poor family life, all of the children and so on. We have to be cognizant again of that problem and be asking ourselves, what does Christianity have to say about that? We think of the racial questions which are still so real in our country and in many ways that we have not solved them. We think about the peace question and how we are to spend our money as a nation in terms of armaments as opposed to helping people out in humanitarian ways. I was talking to somebody the other day, and they were saying, as they grew up through their late teens and early 20s, they had no perception of what was going on in the world at all. We were reminiscing about things that happened back in the 50s, for example. And the woman was saying, I went through all that period, and I hardly remember anything about it. And now here we have a lack of attention. I know a lot of the students that I teach today, they don't watch the news, for example. They don't know what's going on in the world. Well, how are we ever going to apply Christian principles to that? How are we ever going to pray properly? How are we going to try to relate our spirituality to the real world if we aren't even in touch with what is going on? So being attentive to our experience means attentiveness to our experience as citizens of the United States. And to what is all of the movements in our country, the important issues that we face. Now, the second rule is to be intelligent or to be insightful. That is, to try to gain an understanding of what this experience is all about. This is, as Lonergan says, is part of the way that we try to learn. He uses a great example of gaining insight is taken from in his book, at the beginning of his book, Insight. He talks about Archimedes being in the baths and discovering the displacement of water theory and running out of the baths naked yelling, "Eureka!" So the eureka of Archimedes is a prime model for insight, of learning something, of saying, I see it. It is to be inquiring, to be searching, what is this life of mine all about, and to come to the point then of saying, aha, I see something about it now. I understand it. In fact, it's sort of simple. I think very often our best spiritual insights have that simplicity about them. They're not complex at all. They're a matter of just saying, my heavens, I see it now. I have not been good to this neighbor of mine at all. The gospel says I should love her, and I really have just turned her off. It's just crystal clear to me. An example of gaining an insight that really would help us to grow. Now, the problem here is very often that people will not trust their own insights. I know I was talking to one woman who told me that, she says, I always think that other people know better than I do. I always think other people are right and I am wrong. Now, that experience is repeated over and over. That is a question of not trusting one's own experience, not trusting one's own insights or intelligence. And I think we really need to develop this. In other words, what about people trying to understand the Scriptures on their own base? I talk to so many people who go to church and say, well, I don't get anything out of the homilies. And I always encourage them, well, try to pay attention and probably there's something there. But there's really another approach, too, that would say, why don't you listen to those Scriptures and meditate on them yourself? See what insights you can get from it. Maybe you don't need a homilist right now, a preacher to tell you how that applies to your life. Maybe you could sort that out yourself. This business that I was saying before about understanding our own rhythms in life, that would be great to get a feeling for our own pace of things, of when we need to go to confession and how often we need to pray and when we have to make our yearly retreat, or if how long a period of time we need to take to meditate, or how much scripture reading do I need to do. all of things which relate directly to our prayer life or development of the inner life, maybe we need to be in touch with that rhythm. Everyone is different about that. Some people like to go to Mass every day, for example. Other people like to go only once a week, for example. And other people feel that their rhythm is spaced out more than that. So, but people would have to end up in one way or another recognizing this and learning from it. The third rule is that to be reasonable, that is, to be able to make good judgments about what goes on in our lives, about the insights we have. Not every bright idea we get is really true. It really needs to be tested very often. And I think here we probably are going to get a sort of corrective to the notion of trusting our own experience. That is, we need to learn to be able to make good judgments on our own, but we have to recognize that we need help in doing that. We need to be members of a community. Now, I'm talking all the time here about trusting our own experience, and that's a great thing, and there's many people who are learning to do that, and I'm all for it. I think you get this in that notion of people saying, well, I'm beginning to like myself. For example, I read a column not long ago, somebody was knocking that idea. But I suppose it does have a sort of positive ring to it. I talk to a lot of people who say, yeah, I am learning to trust my experience. And for some of them, they say it rather defiantly, and they're sort of angry about the people in the past who told them, hey, you don't have a thought in your head, or you just listen to me, or just be obedient. I find other people who are saying it with sort of an enthusiasm, like, wow, this is terrific, I'm learning to trust my experience, almost as though maybe they were the first ones ever to discover this approach. And others say it in sort of a evangelical tone, which indicates that, boy, they got to tell others. If you're not trusting your experience, you're out of it, something wrong with you. Now, this is a good thing, in general, that people are learning this, but it is not the final word in the spiritual life. That can take us off in a new sort of individualistic kick. It can end up in saying, well, I'm going to do my own thing. I don't listen to anybody anymore. Nobody can tell me anything. I'm going down my own path. It's almost, people have a feeling as though they're the only ones who have ever walked down that path before. There's nothing to learn. They end up walking alone or in a vacuum and eventually getting hurt in one way or another. So there is a corrective here which says that we need the help of the community. We need a larger grouping that we're close to. That's what the church really ought to be. The church provides us with a larger perspective. As Catholic people, we're members of a very large church with a very long tradition, with all kind of insights and wisdom that people have gained throughout the years. We are able to tap that. We often need to bounce our own perceptions up against that. We have to say, yeah, this is the way it seems to me. Now, how have other people seen it? So we get that's one of the great things about belonging to a universal church. It gives us historical perspective. It gives us geographical perspective, because there's people from various cultures who are involved in this church, all feeding into the large collected wisdom of this group of followers who are all committed to Jesus Christ. Now, we need this, too, at a much more personal level, at a local level. All of us need a community of people that we can talk to. People that we're close to, who understand us and who are willing to give us criticism. I think that's one of the great marks of friendship, when we're able to really criticize one another in a spirit of charity and out of love. So we really need that grouping of people that can help us sort out our own experience. We can't go it alone. I have this theory that a lot of our really poor decisions are made in isolation and silence, mainly because we won't bring them to the light of day. We are afraid to tell our friends or our advisors or the people we're close to what we're thinking about or what we've decided, because we know it won't stand the light of day. So what we really need to do is to learn this art of dialogue. to locate ourselves into a larger community that will both support and challenge us. See, I think it works both ways, support and challenge. What I need is a group of people around me who tell me, hey, yeah, keep going, keep thinking for yourself, learn to trust your own experience, make your own decisions, we can't make them for you, and so on, who support and say, even when I make a mistake, and people are there and say, well, you tried, or you're with it, or you get A for effort, something like that. But also, this community of people must be challenging. No, they have to make me think it through carefully. They have to tell me when I'm wrong. They have to suggest the areas where I am limited. I think that happens for people maybe in family life at times. At least the best of our families function that way. A lot of people are finding that sort of thing in prayer groups, for example. Sometimes in parishes, maybe smaller parishes, people will find that kind of interaction. But wherever we find it, it's a blessed thing for us. We really ought to be thanking God for that kind of gift, because it's one of the best things that we have. So we are to be reasonable people. To be reasonable means that we are trying to think for ourselves and make judgments about whether our insights are good or bad, true or false, and we're getting a lot of input in doing that. That the young people I deal with today very often do not have a feel for this. They are so enamored of this business of being off to school by themselves and thinking for themselves and putting away the things of the child and not listening to their parents anymore, that they forget their need to enter into dialogue with other people, forget the need to accept the challenge, and so on. Now, the fourth rule of Lonergan says that we are to be responsible. Someone has once said that there's two ways to walk through life. One is upright, and the other one is being dragged. To be responsible means that we take charge of our own lives, that we're able to say, yes, I have decided this. And when we are wrong, to be able to say, yes, I made a mistake. A part of sense of responsibility is to be able to say, I sinned. I did not follow my conscience. I failed here. Well, when we're thinking about our lives and so on, we have to remember that try as we might to put the responsibility on somebody else, we can't. Freedom is a burden that's given to us. As a modern 20th century philosopher says, we are condemned to be free. In other words, we can't get away from it. We can try, we can escape, we can say, well, it was his fault, or she made me do it, or as Flip Wilson always used to say, the devil made me do it. We can put the responsibility back on that Satan figure and refuse to accept it for ourselves. But all of that really is an illusion. All of that is a false, escapist approach, because the fact of the matter is that we are responsible for our own lives, and we might as well admit it and get on with the business of walking through life. I often tell people that on Judgment Day, the Pope isn't going to be there, and I'm not going to be there as the priest. You're going to be there. You, me. We're the ones who will have to stand before the judge one day and give an account of our own lives. Now that puts a frightening business. But if we are to be involved in this spiritual growth and trusting our own experience, it will involve this business of being responsible for our own actions. Now, I think that Lonergan's whole schema here is very helpful. I've often been interested in this question of the dynamics of the spiritual life. That is, how do we continue to grow as individuals? How do we keep from getting in a rut? How do we keep from just being little children? After all, we are supposed to be striving for an adult spirituality. Our spiritual life has to keep pace with our life in other ways. I very often talk to individuals who are extremely competent. I think of men that I know who are have a lot of responsibility in their jobs, which they accept wholeheartedly. They take care of a family. I think of women who, in the home, do all of these things which demand such tremendous skill of taking care of children, the psychology, the managing the home, all of that. They do that with tremendous responsibility for their lives. And yet, when it comes to explicitly religious matters, it is almost as though they become little children. They almost put it aside. They don't think they can think for themselves anymore. It's a strange oscillation between a world of adulthood and a world of childish religion. I sometimes think that people think the model of the Christian person is a little girl in a white dress who just made her first communion. In other words, who is still childish. The Lord did say that we should be childlike, that we should have the trust of the little children, or maybe He meant that we should be immersed in the moment, in the now, as little children are. But He certainly didn't mean that we should put our brains on hold or set aside our intelligence as Christian people. So that if this learning to trust our experience means that we take the explicit religious part of it and learn to trust ourselves in that area as well, that we try to become more adult kind of Christians and put us away the whole business of being a child in this spiritual life. I like to tell those people who, almost want me to program out their spiritual life, hey, I can't do that. You have to get on the road by yourself. I'm happy to support you. I'm happy to give you advice. I'm happy to tell you what the Christian tradition has said on a given question if I happen to know it. But you must take hold for yourself. Really, the day of borrowing spiritualities ought to be gone. That really has not worked for us. What we need is a situation in which people's growth in faith keeps pace with their growth in other ways. I talk with a lot of students who are growing in their understanding of secular subjects, learning science and the human sciences and so on, and developing, growing in their social life. And I'm always telling them, hey, you must make sure that your Christianity keeps pace with that you have an adult understanding of your religion. Otherwise, you are going to be out of sync. Otherwise, they aren't going to be in any sort of accord with one another, and you're going to feel as though this childish religious thing needs to be put aside. And so I'm constantly encouraging them to study, to grow in their explicit religious life as well. They can't borrow. They can't just come in and take the spirituality and the theology I want to give them. What I tell them is think critically about it. Study, learn, try to assimilate it into your own life. So if we can try to put this whole thing together now, what I'm suggesting is we need a spirituality where we live as citizens of the United States in the 1980s. And one of our problems has been that we've been borrowing too much, just taking uncritically, drinking it in from others, and we can't do that anymore. What we've got to do is to learn to trust our own experience in a constructive way. That means being attentive to what is going on, listening for the Word of God in our own experience. It means being in touch with the problems we face as members of a parish and as citizens of the United States. We have to learn to be insightful, to have our own eureka moments about the spiritual life. So at times, I see it, it's so simple, I know now what I've got to do. The Lord's will is clear for me here, and I really must try to act on it. We have to learn to make good judgments, to be reasonable people, especially to let our experience be critiqued by others, to enter into dialogue with a larger community. We really all need that. We need to listen to those people around us. And we need to become more responsible people, take hold of our lives. We don't want to wake up someday and say, I just drifted all through life. What a terrible thing that would be to wake up late in one's life and say, I never took hold. All I did was drift all the way along. Far better to say, no, I tried to get up. I wouldn't let them drag me anymore. I got up on my own 2 feet. I made some mistakes, but I tried. I took responsibility for my own life. And I have done that with a confidence that God is the one who walks next to me.
All rights to this talk are reserved by St. Anthony Messenger Press, 1615 Republic Street, Cincinnati, Ohio, 45210.